When I detected hidden cameras in my house, I confronted my husband on live video. They say the walls have ears. But what no one tells you is how much it shatters your soul when the walls have eyes too. I'm Elise. 32. Analytical by nature, cautious by upbringing, and married for 5 years to a man I thought I knew. Last Thursday, I found a tiny black dot under the rim of the smoke detector in our bedroom. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. But something about the light blinking when it shouldn't have flickered stopped me mid-fold of the laundry. I reached for a stool. My fingers trembled as I removed the cover. And there it was. A camera. A live feed camera. Hidden. I stood in silence for a full minute, like my brain had jammed. No gasping, no drama. Just a hollow kind of stillness. I didn't touch it further. Instead, I walked out of the room and sat on the edge of the bathtub until my breathing slowed. My first thought wasn't fear. It was betrayal. Quiet, concentrated betrayal that settled deep in my spine. No one else had access to this house. Our home. My sanctuary. And suddenly, it felt like every moment I'd spent alone wasn't mine after all. The camera wasn't the only one. I found 2 more. One inside a vent in my home office. Another, this one almost grotesquely hidden, behind the book spine of a hollowed-out copy of Wuthering Heights on the living room shelf. I never touched any of them beyond initial discovery. But I documented everything: photos, timestamps, the serial numbers. That night, I pretended nothing had changed. I kissed my husband on the cheek when he came home from work. Stirred the risotto, laughed at his story about a client. And when we went to bed, I turned out the light and lay in the dark, eyes open, cataloging every possible motive he could have. Maybe I already knew. But I needed more than suspicion. The next morning, I called in sick. Then I started searching. And what I found in his office downstairs, in a locked drawer I picked open with a bobby pin, changed everything. A hard drive. Password protected. But my husband is predictable. Inside were folders named with dates. Each one a week. Each one labeled by room. Bedroom. Office. Kitchen. Hundreds of hours of footage. It didn't matter how much of it I watched. I saw enough. Me undressing. Me on the phone. Me crying after a tough day at work. Private moments. Sacred ones. All catalogued by the man I married. That night, I didn't speak. I just smiled. Told him I was tired. Said I had an early meeting. But I wasn't going to bed early. I was planning. He was going to lose everything. And it was going to happen in front of the same camera he'd used to watch me. The livestream was set for 9 p.m. Saturday. I sent the link to a private group of 12 people, his closest friends, his boss, his sister, and the HR director at his firm. No subject line. No message. Just the link. He was in the shower when the feed went live. I adjusted the angle, making sure the living room light cast just enough on the couch where I sat, laptop open. He walked out in his towel, confused. And when he saw me holding the hard drive, he froze. I said, "You're live." Smile. He said nothing. The cameras. I found them. All of them. Still silent. I continued, "This is your footage. Your collection. You spied on me, Mark. In every room. 4 years." His mouth opened. No words came. Then I said, "Everyone you care about is watching. Your boss. Your sister. HR. The police are next." He lunged. But I was already on my feet, stepping back. And that's when the front door opened. Because I'd planned that too. And standing there was my best friend, holding her phone up, live streaming from her account. He stopped in his tracks. I looked at her and nodded. Then I said, calmly, this is what it looks like when a woman reclaims her life. And I walked out, not looking back, as the stream kept rolling. I didn't need to hear what happened next. I had everything I needed. And he had everything he deserved. I learned how to lie to survive in my mother's house. Not with words, she always caught those, but with silence. With masking. With the art of being exactly what she needed and nothing more. My mother was clinical, elegant, and meticulous in the way people admire from a distance but avoid up close. Nothing in our house was ever out of place. Emotions, least of all. She used to say, women who feel too much live short lives. I believed her for a while. Until I met my father's mother, my grandmother Jane. Jane was the kind of woman who kept mismatched china and told stories over Earl Grey with reckless candor. She wore large scarves, embroidered slippers, and always smelled like lavender and lemon. She taught me how to see through the performance. When I was 12, she handed me a copy of The Art of War, dog-eared and annotated with lipstick. She said, "You're going to need this. Not now. But later." She was right. Jane died 2 months before I met Mark. I was 27, newly promoted, and dangerously lonely. He was gentle, soft-spoken, the kind of man who remembered how you liked your coffee and where you left your keys. The kind of man who listened. Or so it seemed. But Jane had taught me how to read absence. And sometimes, what people don't say is louder than any confession. Mark never asked about my grandmother. When I brought her up, he changed the subject. He didn't attend the funeral. Said he had a conference. I excused it then. I excused a lot of things. The first year of marriage was quiet. Too quiet. He traveled often. And when he was home, he was oddly still, always watching, always poised, like he was waiting for something I hadn't given yet. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me when I cooked. Not in affection. In study. As if trying to memorize something. But I told myself I was being paranoid. Because paranoia was the enemy of good marriages. My mother said so. And she had stayed married. My father, though, he left when I was 15. I never got the full story. Just a postmarked envelope with a photograph of a beach and no note inside. My mother threw it in the trash. Jane retrieved it later and gave it to me in secret. She said, he left because he stopped recognizing the person he had to be in that house. I looked at the photo for years, trying to decipher the message. But I see it now. Mark didn't see me. He saw a role. A wife. A concept. And I kept trying to mold myself into something he might love. It didn't start with the cameras. It started with the absence of questions. The way he never asked how my day was, but always knew what time I left. The way he noticed when I moved a vase or bought a new lotion but never commented unless prompted. He was watching long before the footage confirmed it. And I, like my mother before me, kept performing normal. Until I couldn't. Until the silence of our home grew louder than my own thoughts. After the confrontation, I drove to a motel off the interstate. I didn't cry. I didn't sleep. I just sat with the quiet that was finally mine again. The next morning, I called in a favor. Jane had left me more than memories. She left me a lawyer. A quiet, unassuming man who sent me birthday cards with legal quotes and once got a neighbor's dog out of a fine for barking past curfew. He said, "Elise, I'll handle this. Just send me everything." And I did. Every file. Every video. Every timestamp. He didn't ask how I was. He knew better. Because some things are too raw for comfort. That afternoon, I turned off my phone and drove to the coast. I walked until my feet hurt. I watched the gulls fighting over something invisible to me. And I thought about Jane's scarf drawer. How every silk square told a story. How she'd say, "Choose your armor. Then make it look like fashion." I missed her so much it hurt. But I also knew I was becoming the version of myself she always saw. The one who didn't flinch. The one who waited. Who watched. Who chose the time, the place, the camera. Mark had watched me through the walls. But he never saw who I really was. And now, I had no intention of hiding ever again. People don't always retaliate with fists or fury. Sometimes, they retaliate with silence so absolute it becomes a mirror. The pressure started subtly. 2 voicemails from his sister. Not angry, concerned. She said she was confused. She wanted to understand my side. There was no side. There was evidence. And her brother had recorded it. Then came the emails from his boss. At first, tentative. Then legal. I forwarded them all to Jane's lawyer. I never replied. But the text messages kept coming. First from Mark. Then from numbers I didn't recognize. Friends, probably. Mutuals. People who wanted to believe there was some mistake. There wasn't. And beneath every word of concern was a layer of discomfort. Because what I had done, what I had revealed, made them all complicit in their silence. They'd praised our marriage. Envied it. Used it as a model. And now, they had to reckon with how little they had seen. My mother called once. She said, "I saw the video. You should have handled it privately." I replied, "You would have. I am not you." She didn't call again. The pressure mutated after that. From questions to consequences. HR meetings at his firm. Internal investigations. His reputation was unraveling quietly, precisely, the way he had once unraveled mine. Mark tried calling 3 times. Then sent an email. He said, "We can fix this. Just take it down." I didn't reply. Instead, I posted screenshots of the footage directory. No faces. Just file names. Timestamps. Enough to show it was real. After that, he stopped trying. But the house, the one we shared, became a battlefield. Not overt. But legal. He filed for ownership. Claimed the cameras were for security. My lawyer responded with affidavits, expert analyses, and quiet, damning clarity. It was exhausting. Not the legal battle, but the emotional erosion. Each document I reviewed was a reminder. Each court motion, a relic of something I'd rather bury. Even my best friend grew quiet for a while. She said, "I didn't know it was this deep." And I just nodded. Because what do you say to that? When someone you love confesses they weren't really looking? At night, I started waking in cold sweats. Not from fear. But from the ghost of observation. There were no cameras now. But I'd internalized the feeling of being watched. That's the part no one talks about. The watching doesn't stop when the cameras do. The mind becomes its own surveillance. Eventually, I moved in with Jane's old friend, a woman in her 60s who lived in a cottage filled with cats and wind chimes. She let me stay in the back room, rent-free. "We all need shelter when we're being hunted," she said. She didn't ask for details. Just made tea and played settee on her ancient record player. And there, in that silence, I began to rebuild. No declarations. No new beginnings. Just a little more breath in my chest each morning. Until one afternoon, while watering her begonias, she said, "You know, watching isn't always about power. Sometimes it's about fear." I asked, "Fear of what?" She replied, "Of being truly seen." I didn't respond. But the words followed me back to the guest room. And that night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming. There is a kind of strategy that doesn't feel like plotting, it feels like breath returning to the body. I started with the bank accounts. Jane had helped me set up my own years ago, long before Mark. Separate. Quiet. I hadn't touched them in years, but I still had the keys. I moved my salary there first. Then the savings I'd kept joint, siphoned out a little at a time. Not to hide, but to prepare. Because survival isn't just about escape. It's about foundation. Next came the property. The house was in both our names. He'd filed a claim. I filed a counterclaim. But I also dug up the emails, the texts, the receipts for every improvement I had personally paid for. Jane's lawyer compiled it all, methodically, unemotionally. He said, "We'll win this. It will take time. But we'll win." I didn't need to win. I needed to be free. Still, I kept building. I created a digital record, organized folders, timelines, transcripts. A curated map of the erosion. Not for court. For memory. Because part of healing, I was learning, is confronting not just the trauma, but the scaffolding that held it up. My mornings became rituals. Coffee, walks, silent meals at a small cafe where the waitress didn't ask questions. In the evenings, I helped Jane's friend with her garden. She showed me how to prune vines back so they could breathe. Sometimes, I thought of that as metaphor. Other times, it was just pruning. Then, one morning, I woke to find an envelope slid under my door. No return address. Inside was a single flash drive. I plugged it in with shaking hands. It held footage. Not of me. Of Mark. Alone. Watching. Rewatching. Speaking into a camera, cataloging his feelings. The date stamps were recent. He said, "She won't talk to me. She won't look at me." And then, quieter, "I think she always knew." He was unraveling. But it wasn't satisfying. It was eerie. I shut the laptop. Deleted the files. Burned the envelope. I told no one. Because strategy also means knowing what to keep, and what to let dissolve. By the third month, I had a plan. Not for revenge. But for distance. I filed to sell the house. Bought out his claim. Settled quietly. Then I submitted my resignation at work. No explanation. Just a date. Jane's lawyer said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Yes." I booked a train instead of a plane. I wanted to see the distance stretch. And before I left, I walked through the empty house one last time. No anger. No sadness. Just recognition. Of what had been built there. And what I would never allow again. He didn't know I was back in town. And that was the point. I arrived on a Monday morning, hours before the courthouse appointment. I checked into a hotel across from his office building and watched from the window as he arrived at 9:08 a.m., tie crooked, shoulders tense. Even from 6 floors up, I could see the erosion. It hadn't taken long. He still parked in the same corner spot. Still carried the same monogrammed briefcase I'd given him 3 anniversaries ago. Everything about him screamed control. But the edges had begun to fray. My lawyer had set the meeting. Not in court, not yet. But neutral territory. A mediation room on the 2nd floor of a quiet office complex, with soundproof walls and uncomfortable chairs. We needed to finalize the property division. But I had added one request, a face-to-face. Not for closure. That's a myth. But for confrontation. Strategic, controlled, undeniable confrontation. He arrived late. Purposefully, I think. Posture stiff, eyes scanning for weakness. He didn't find any. I wore navy. Neutral. No jewelry except Jane's ring. No makeup except the red lipstick she always said made my mouth look like it knew secrets. He sat across from me, arms folded. The mediator offered coffee. We both declined. He said, "I didn't think you'd show." I replied, "I didn't come for you." The documents were already in front of us. Deeds. Financial breakdowns. Digital forensics reports. But the paper wasn't the point. It never was. He skimmed the numbers, jaw tight. He knew they were fair. Knew my team had been methodical. He said, "You could have asked me to take them down." I said, "You didn't ask me before putting them up." He didn't respond. Just looked at the table, at the grain in the wood like it might give him an out. Then he looked up. He said, "You embarrassed me." And I replied, "You violated me." Silence settled between us. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that presses against your ribs. The mediator cleared her throat and redirected us to the documents. I signed mine without pause. He hesitated, then scribbled his name like a man resigning, not agreeing. She left us alone for a moment to scan the copies. I said, "You used to say you loved how composed I was. How self-contained." He nodded, slowly. I added, "That wasn't a compliment. That was a test. You were watching to see how long I could hold it together." He said, "I just wanted to understand you." I replied, "No. You wanted to control what you couldn't understand." His face flickered, like a current shorting. There was no anger now. Just fatigue. He said, "I never touched the footage. Never shared it." I said, "You didn't need to. You already took what you needed." That was the real betrayal. The intimacy stolen, not shared. The sacred made data. He leaned back in the chair and let out a breath he didn't deserve to release in front of me. I watched him. And for the first time I didn't feel fear. Or anger. Or even sadness. I felt absence. The absence of anything left between us. When the mediator returned, the room resumed its formal rhythm. Final checks. Signatures confirmed. Copies stamped. We stood at the same time. He opened the door for me, instinct or habit, I don't know. Outside, the hallway echoed. He said, "So this is it?" I turned. I said, "This is the part where you stop watching." And I walked away. But I didn't leave town yet. I had one last meeting. That evening, I met with the HR director from his firm. She had asked for it weeks ago, after the footage circulated, after their internal investigation stalled. I'd agreed, on one condition, confidentiality. We met in a quiet bar near the waterfront. She was already there, hair pinned up, face set with the tension of someone who knew their job would never quite be clean again. She ordered tea. I had water. I handed her a folder. Not the footage. Just timelines, receipts, a statement. She said, "I believe you." I said, "It's not about belief. It's about prevention." She nodded. Said nothing more. When I stood to leave, she touched my hand. She whispered, "What he did wasn't just wrong. It was pathological." I looked her in the eye. I said, "And now it's documented." I didn't look back. Because justice, for me, wasn't courtroom declarations or viral sympathy. It was consequence. It was the quiet, steady dismantling of a man who thought he could record everything and still remain unseen. I left the city the next morning. Train window cracked. Bag light. No destination announced to anyone but myself. And as the platform faded, I thought of Jane. Her velvet voice. Her warnings disguised as jokes. And I knew. The confrontation was over. But the transformation had just begun. Closure doesn't announce itself. It slips in like fog, quiet, slow, irreversible. I didn't celebrate. There was no champagne, no cathartic cry in the shower, no ritual cleansing of the past. Just a deepening quiet. A life that started to feel like mine again, not a performance or a perimeter breach. The train took me north, then west. I got off in a small town with no expectations attached. I rented a studio above a bakery. The scent of rising bread woke me each morning. It was grounding, human, almost sacred. There were no cameras. I checked anyway, the first few nights. Out of habit. But slowly, that edge wore down. I started sleeping with the door unlocked. Then with the window cracked. Eventually, with my mind silent. There were practical things to handle. Utilities in my name, new banking passwords, a new driver's license with just my name, no hyphen, no echo of him. The house sold. The profits were split. I didn't check what he did with his half. I didn't care. What mattered was this: I was no longer the object in someone else's frame. I got a part-time job at a used bookstore. The owner was soft-spoken, slightly hunched, and always smelled like mothballs and wood polish. He didn't ask questions. Just handed me a key, showed me how to run the till, and asked if I could alphabetize the biographies. I could. In the evenings, I walked. Through foggy streets, over broken sidewalks, past the flicker of porch lights and muted televisions. Nobody knew who I was. Nobody watched. And still, I watched myself. Not in fear. But in restoration. I listened to my own voice in my head, and it didn't sound rehearsed anymore. Every few weeks, I checked in with Jane's lawyer. There were residual filings, formalities, the long tail of legal severance. But it was all proceeding quietly, without friction. He said, "You're free now. You know that, don't you?" I replied, "I'm learning." I didn't post anything. Not on social media, not to friends. I didn't explain where I'd gone. Because absence was its own statement. And because healing doesn't need an audience. One morning, I received a letter. No return address. Postmark smudged. Inside was a single photograph, a beach. No note. It was the same image my father had once sent from silence. The one my mother threw away. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if this was coincidence, echo, or something else. Maybe someone was reminding me, people disappear in layers. I pinned it to the fridge. Not as a mystery to solve. But as a reminder, sometimes, the unanswered things carry their own peace. A few weeks later, the HR director emailed. Brief, respectful. She said, "His employment was terminated last month. Thank you for your courage." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. It wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was consequence. It was the invisible thread between action and accountability finally made visible. In the bookstore, I began organizing the psychology section. I found a worn copy of The Gift of Fear. Jane had underlined half of it. Her name was in the front cover. I took it home. No charge. The past wasn't behind me. It was folded into me. But I was no longer ruled by it. One night, the bakery owner invited me to a community dinner. I went. I brought an apple tart. I sat with strangers who didn't know a thing about me and didn't care. It was the kind of anonymity that heals. Someone asked what brought me here. I said, a change. Nothing more. And they nodded like it made perfect sense. Because sometimes, that's all it is. A change. A line redrawn. I found myself smiling more. Not because I was happy. But because I wasn't hiding. There's a difference. I saw a therapist once a week. She was kind. Blunt. Wore oversized sweaters and never blinked when I mentioned surveillance, betrayal, or grief. She said, "You were groomed to doubt yourself. That doesn't disappear. But it can dissolve." We talked about trust. Not in others, but in my own perception. How to recalibrate. How to stop flinching when nothing moved. I started writing again. Not a memoir. Not a confession. Just notes. Scenes. Fragments of a voice I was learning to believe again. Sometimes I wrote about Jane. Sometimes I wrote about silence. Mostly, I wrote to prove I was still here. A few weeks before winter, I got another letter. It wasn't from him. But it was about him. An old college friend. She'd seen the video. Wanted to reach out, but didn't know how. She said, "I should have seen it." "I'm sorry." I didn't respond. Because apology doesn't undo complicity. But I appreciated the effort. It was the closest thing to accountability I'd seen from that circle. Winter came slowly. Snow dusted the sidewalks. The bookstore hung twinkle lights. I wore Jane's scarf and didn't cry when I smelled her perfume on it. The HR director sent one last message, weeks later. They had updated their internal policies. Mandatory consent reviews. Surveillance training. She wrote, "Small change. But real." I believed her. Because systems don't change all at once. They shift under pressure. Quietly. Then permanently. And that's what I had become. A quiet pressure. Unyielding. Necessary. As I stood behind the register one day, a woman came in and asked for something strong but quiet. I handed her The Art of War. She laughed. Said, "That's not what I meant." I smiled. "It's what I meant." She bought it. That night, I lit a candle Jane had once given me. Lavender and lemon. I opened my window. And I sat in the dark, watching the snow fall, not watched. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Peace doesn't arrive with fanfare. It comes in small, nearly invisible increments, a morning without dread, a night without reflexive checking, the moment you realize no one is watching but you. That's when I knew I had rebuilt something. Not a fortress. Not armor. Just space. Breathable, living space where my mind didn't echo with the weight of his presence anymore. I started keeping a journal. Not of what happened, those details were already documented, boxed, and stored. I wrote about now. About wind patterns. The way light fell through the bakery window at 3:47 p.m. The exact shape of silence when snow blanketed the town. It was a kind of intimacy I hadn't known I missed. One with myself. I adopted a cat from the shelter. A gray one with mismatched eyes and a crooked tail. I named her Cypher. She didn't like to be held, but she followed me room to room, always nearby but never intrusive. I respected her boundaries. She respected mine. We coexisted quietly. One Sunday, the bakery owner asked if I'd like to take over the lease above his shop. He was retiring, moving south. I didn't hesitate. I bought it. The apartment was mine now. Fully. Legally. Emotionally. I repainted the walls. Off-white with blue-gray trim. I removed every old nail from the previous tenant's decor and patched the holes. Every mark I left from now on would be mine. I took Jane's scarf and framed it. Hung it above my desk. Below it, a shelf with her books, the flash drive she once joked I'd thank her for one day, and a small ceramic box I never opened but always kept. I kept the photo of the beach on my fridge. Sometimes I looked at it and wondered if my father ever found peace. Or if, like Mark, he stayed trapped in a loop of observation and detachment. Some people never stop watching. But I had stopped being watchable. I had stopped performing. And in that choice, I reclaimed something deeper than safety. I reclaimed privacy as sacred. The bookstore grew busier in the spring. A new owner moved in, young, passionate, obsessed with poetry. She asked if I'd stay on. I said, only if I don't have to recommend romance. She laughed. She agreed. One evening, she asked, "Have you ever thought about publishing?" I said, "Once." She replied, "Maybe you should think again." I didn't say yes. But I didn't say no. Because this new life wasn't about decisions made quickly. It was about feeling their shape, their consequence. On the anniversary of the confrontation, I didn't do anything dramatic. I made tea. I lit a candle. I reread the transcript of the livestream once, quietly. Then I deleted it. Some things deserve a proper burial. I wrote one final letter. To myself. Not to forgive. But to recognize. To acknowledge the woman who survived. Who waited. Who watched. Who left. I signed it, Jane would be proud. Then I burned it. Let the ashes fall into the garden behind the building. Cypher watched from the window, tail twitching. And I stood there until the wind took the last bit of ash away. That night, I dreamed of silence. Not the kind he gave me. The kind I chose. And when I woke, I didn't reach for anything. I just breathed. Because the story was over. And I was still here. Still whole. Still watching. But only the sky.